All right, everybody, I am back with my second DC update of the day. No sooner did I get the last video posted, and I got bombarded with messages from people saying, hey, Zack Snyder was just on the Joe Rogan Experience. And so they had just posted on YouTube, and I watched the whole thing, and I've got some highlights to talk about here today, and we're going to discuss what he talked about during this interview. Now, I'll tell you right off, Joe Rogan did not ask the hard questions. He didn't ask him about the Snyderverse being restored, but he did have some interesting insights into the fandom and some other things, and also what Zack Snyder would like to do if he gets to continue with DC. So I took some bullet points of the more interesting things from this thing, but I would encourage everybody to go find Joe Rogan's channel and watch the video all the way through as well. The first thing that was discussed was that if Zack Snyder had a chance to do his dream job, his dream movie, what would it be? And he said, without question, it is The Dark Knight Returns. He said if he ever gets a chance to do The Dark Knight Returns, he'll be done with superhero movies forever. So that is his dream job. It's always been that way, even when, before he did Man of Steel, but the studios didn't want him to do anything like that at the time. So that was interesting. Another thing he talked about is they talked at length about Watchmen and also 300. And Joe Rogan was surprised to find out that none of the people in 300 were CGI, that all the people were actually in shape and they didn't use any CGI to make the men look larger. And in fact, it was actually a pretty fun thing to watch. And he did talk about, Zack Snyder talked about how every scene in 300 was shot indoors, and that the studio was hesitant to allow him to make it because of I think Troy had come out at that point, and they didn't want anything to interfere. And when he was filming it, there was only one shot that was done outside, and it has to do with some horses coming up over a hill. And he talks about that and shows that scene in the actual podcast. He went on to talk about technology also, and that he keeps physical copies of all the movies that he makes. And I'm not talking about the DVD or anything like that. He keeps actual physical film of everything that he does because he doesn't trust technology to work in the future. And he had some interesting analogies talking about how record players work versus phones, and how he can explain how a record player works, and his kids find that stuff fascinating, but yet they've got the phones in their hands and they can bring up music whenever they want, and there's no way to tell how that actually works. Some interesting stuff. They talked a bit about playing video games, and this is pretty interesting. Both Joe would play Quake. Joe Rogan would play Quake and waste so many hours on it. And then you had Zack Snyder talking about his obsession with, why am I forgetting the name of it? It's a real popular game, Fortnite. I've never played Fortnite, but Zack Snyder has, and it has sucked up a whole bunch of his time. I think I've talked about that in a previous video, how his wife actually made him get into pottery because of how much time it was sucking away from him and how he could have been doing so many other things. They got into a deep conversation about Batman and Superman and how he categorized these characters in his films, and that the studio, and there are diehard people who didn't want Batman to kill, didn't want Superman to have to kill Zod, but he talked about how in the real world that isn't going to work that way, that those people could never be those individuals and not be those people. That was more of something Joe Rogan said, but Zack Snyder was coming at it from the angle of, well, let's put them into situations that they've never had to be in so that we could show them that heroes aren't always going to win or make the right, well, not necessarily make the right choices, but have to make the hard choices. And it was interesting for him to talk about Batman and Superman that way, especially Batman. And what was really interesting about this conversation was how he talked about Ben Affleck actually being Batman. He said when he chose him, he picked it because the guy's already like 6'2" to begin with, but then when you put the suit on, he's raised up another 2 inches. And then you add the bodysuit onto him, and he said that this guy really embodied Batman. Like when he was in the room, it was like a force to be reckoned with. And so that was kind of interesting that he was talking about just how awesome Ben Affleck was as Batman, and it's a shame that we're not going to get him anymore. They talked about why Batman vs. Superman was rated R, and the main reason it was rated R when it got released on video is because the studio didn't want him to actually have Batman fight Superman. He's like, well, that's kind of the whole point of the film. And when the cut got put into theaters, like, they really had to cut it down so they wouldn't get that R rating. And they talked about how arbitrary the R rating actually is with the stuff that they do. Then he talked a bit about the toxic fandom. This was brought up by both Joe Rogan and also Zack Snyder, and they both fought for people like myself and others who like Snyder's work, and especially these characters that they're in charge of and how we care about these characters. And it's no different from somebody loving their sports team or loving music, and that, you know, these characters, we want them to be done right. And Zack Snyder took that job very, very, very seriously. And he went on to say he doesn't know of any other fandom. He goes, he doesn't like these fans to be called toxic, you know, the Snyder fans. And he said he doesn't know any other fandom that has raised as much money, toxic fandom, that has raised as much money as the Snyder fans have for suicide awareness. And he thanked everybody for that, and it's pretty awesome. It is. The fandom is nowhere near as toxic as they make it out to be, and they did point out that a lot of the fandoms do have toxic people. Every fandom does, but that's not the majority of Snyder fans. And how most of those people complaining, and I found this out with the person who actually targeted my family, and you know, the FBI got involved and they were making death threats, is that they're probably living a worse life than you are, and they're either jealous or they're just not living a very good life, and this is how they kind of lash out, is to go after people. Then they talked a bit about Rebel Moon, and this is where things start to get interesting. He talked about how the extended version of Rebel Moon is going to come out in August. It is going to be R, and when he says it's going to be R, Joe Rogan was like, is it going to be X? And he's like, well, it has a lot more of everything in it, and he likened it to the heavy metal magazine that I don't even know if it's still around, but was really big back in the 80s, that he really made this weird, bizarre story, and it's going to be completely a different type of journey when you actually get to see it. And each movie is going to have over an hour added into it for one complete journey. They're going to be released on the same date on Netflix in late summer. So he also talked a bit about the Netflix engagement and how much this movie was actually viewed, and he broke it down with all the statistics and how Netflix looks at stuff. And they figured that had this movie been released in theaters and you do $10 a ticket, the movie would have grossed over $1 billion. It would have made more, actually, they said, than what Barbie made. And that's how many people actually watch this from the house. And they said for every stream, they figured at least 2 people on average were watching it. And there were situations, obviously, were more, but they said at a minimum, they figured 2 people were watching it for every stream. And if you did that by the amount of tickets, then it would have made more than Barbie did. So it was a very interesting, fun conversation between him and Joe Rogan. He also talked about a dream project he'd like to do off of a book, Anne Rind, but he doesn't think a studio's ever going to go for it because they feel like that's the material's fascist, which it isn't. I think it's just the opposite of that. So he's never going to think he's ever going to be allowed to make the book that he wants to turn into a movie. All right, guys, so there's my update. I wanted to get this information out there. I highly encourage everybody to go listen to the whole thing. There's a lot of fun stuff that they talk about in there. It was a great 2 hours to just sit back and listen to. Zack Snyder is always the gentleman, and he does bring some interesting conversations to the table. So, all right, guys, I wanted to get this second video out there for you guys. We will see you on the next one.